Hey, John, are you out there?
Yeah, George. How are you?
Good. How are things in the big city?
Well, less than a month to go before my next semester starts, but
Uh,
still chilling.
yeah,
Chilling in New York. It's been really hot and beautiful here. And
chilling under the air conditioner.
yes, right. Yeah, I got that
Yeah,
cranked up.
yeah, which is said according to your male metabolism rather than.
Yes, you
Did
know
you
me
did you
well.
see? You saw Pam Bellick's piece in Science Times about air conditioning and how all the standards for public air conditioning in buildings are set for the male metabolism rather than the female metabolism, and as a result, women are always cold.
It's interesting you say that because my girlfriend Valerie, um, we walk. We're leaving her apartment. It's 95 degrees out, and
Mhm.
she's looking for a scarf or a sweater. And I
Huh.
say, what the hell? And it's because we're going to a movie theater or a restaurant, and she's
Yeah.
worried that she's going to be cold in there because the AC
Yeah.
is so
Yeah.
high.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's interesting. Well, you should, yeah, take a look at Pam's article. It's really interesting and quite a departure for Pam Bellick, since she's usually, off, in Africa writing about Ebola and things. But it's a good piece. And then Dan Engber, our buddy at Slate, had kind of, some interesting critiques of the article. I'm not sure if those are anywhere except Twitter, but I happened to see them scroll by.
well, I saw an interesting piece by Dan on Slate. It
Oh,
must
the
have been.
earlier ACPs.
Yeah, and in which
Yeah.
he talked about the history of this kind of Puritan reaction against
Air
air
conditioning.
conditioning that is being
Right.
revived now among certain sectors of the environmental movement, and
Yeah, oh, right.
including Brooklyn hipsters. Apparently, there's this feeling that AC is decadent.
Oh, well, yeah, yeah, it's terrible, decadent, waste of energy and all of that. But then, as Dan points out, you can make the same argument about heat,
Right.
and yeah, like why did people ever, do something as stupid as colonizing the northeastern part of the United States, when it's so cold and we have to waste all of this energy, heating them, and if they moved to the southwest, they wouldn't have to do that, but they might have to have air conditioning.
Well, I love air conditioning. I mean, I am totally. I love modern life and all the amenities and luxuries and so forth. And my God, air conditioning is it's not even a luxury; it's essential. I remember,
Not in Santa Fe, though.
pardon me.
Not in Santa Fe. I don't have air conditioning.
Really? Well, I guess so. You never have the kind of sweltering
No.
95-degree days that we have here in New York.
When I was walking up to my office, it was just before 10 a.m. and the temperature was 72 degrees.
Oh my God, that's pretty sweet. Well,
I mean,
I
yeah.
built a little cabin in the woods for myself
Really?
about I don't know 15 years ago when I still lived in
Oh.
Garrison, New York,
Oh, 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 yeah,
a little
yeah.
writer's hut,
Hmm.
and I figured I didn't need AC. It was shaded, and
Yeah.
then I don't know, maybe a year or two after I built it, there was a heat wave, and it was okay for the first couple of days, and then it just it really was sweltering inside the office, and then even when the weather cooled off outside, it was still hot in
Hmm.
my office, and I couldn't work. I
Yeah, no, it's
realized,
horrible.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
realized if it's the temperature gets above maybe 80, my brain starts to shut down. It's just not
Yeah.
capable
No,
of
it's horrible.
sustained focus.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I lived through several or a number of New York City summers and one in Washington, D.C., and even Minneapolis. Like August in Minneapolis is just horrible.
Right.
Hot, wet, humid, and of course mosquitoes everywhere. And yeah, so yeah, I'm not an anti-AC purist at all. I'm just lucky not to need it. And to be fair, most summers there's a couple of weeks when you sort of wish you had it in Santa Fe. But this has been like, I think, the coolest summer in Santa Fe in the history of the earth.
Wow.
It's been absolutely amazing. We've it's been raining just enough to keep everything green and beautiful and cool in the daytime, cools off to the mid 50s to 60 at night. And
yeah, that sounds pretty great. You're in your own little paradise there, George.
yeah, well, I don't know if this was, last summer was much hotter, and, the last dozen summers or more have been much, much drier. So this may just be some weird blip as the Earth, kind of readjusts its equilibrium to the new reality.
Well, yeah, and I know that things are a little bit apocalyptic in the Southwest these days. Especially in Southern California.
Oh, yeah.
With the drought.
In Northwest and Canada, and it's just amazing, these forests burning, they're having the kind of fires we usually worry about down here this time of year.
Yeah. I keep waiting for us here in the Northeast to have a summer like we had. I think it was about, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago, 15.
Yeah.
We had a summer where in Garrison, where I was living, this little hamlet on the Hudson River, about 40 miles north of New York City.
Yeah,
it was really dry we had virtually no moisture at all for several months.
Yeah.
And by July or so, there were fires just bursting up all over the place, and it was really frightening. I mean, they were actually prohibiting people from walking in some of the parks because they were so worried about people somehow starting fires.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's fairly routine in the summers here. It has been, but not this summer.
Well, I mean, I've never encountered this before or since in this area. And what happened was, we're right across from West Point, and there was all this wilderness, these mountains around West Point covered with forest. And there was a huge fire. I think it was probably a lightning fire. And it was so severe and threatening inhabited areas that they brought helicopters up from God knows where. And they were scooping water up out of the Hudson and then dropping it on the fires. It was really cool. And so it became kind of an entertainment for people in the area to go down along the Hudson and drink cold beer or wine and sit
and watch the helicopters.
Yeah.
Wow.
And watch the helicopters, and especially at night, it was really apocalyptic because then you could see, in the day you just kind of see some smoke. But at night you could see the glow of the fires.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not an uncommon occurrence out here. And God, we had a 100,000-acre fire in the Jemez Mountains around Los Alamos in 2011. And the smoke was, came very easily into Santa Fe and far beyond, and I could see the glow from my house at night. And we've had fires in the same mountains where ashes have fallen. It's just, you feel like it's something out of the book of Revelation.
And people get strangely excited when those sorts of things happen.
Yeah, maybe less so here because it kind of became a horrible reality for a while and may well continue, especially going to sleep at night and having to smell and breathe smoke.
Right.
And then you do wish you had air conditioning just to filter it out. But,
right.
But, maybe this will be the new climate, in which case Santa Fe will totally luck out, but I'm not expecting it.
Right.
Well, speaking of the environment, I really was interested in a column you wrote. You went to something sponsored by the Breakthrough Institute. Is that right? That's Ted Nordhaus's outfit, right?
It is. Do you know Ted?
I know his sister. Yeah, Hannah, his younger sister, who's an environmental writer, and she wrote a really good book about the problem with bee colony collapse.
Oh, right. And
then she recently wrote a book, A Complete Departure, called American Ghost, in which she has roots in the Southwest, including Santa Fe. Her great something grandmother was one of the early Jewish settlers in Santa Fe and a very prominent citizen. And she and her husband owned a mansion on Palace Avenue that's now a hotel, and it's reputed to be haunted by a ghost. And the ghost is supposed to be that of her long deceased many great grandmother. So it's really a good book, both combining that early history with this personal search to try to find out more about the ghost, quote unquote.
Well, I'm going to have to ask Ted about that.
Yeah,
next
it's
time
really
I see
good.
him.
Yeah, Ted. Yeah, he's an interesting. I find their institute very interesting and their positions and the whole eco-modernist manifesto stuff.
Yeah,
I'm not sure quite what to think.
Well, just to briefly tell people what it's about, I think we might have talked about this last year when I went. The Breakthrough Institute is created by these two guys, Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger, who were environmentalists who became frustrated with some of the failures of the environmental movement to make more progress, and they started questioning some of the strategies and core beliefs of environmentalism itself, and they created this think tank, the Breakthrough Institute, basically to kind of stir up trouble and explore new ideas, new ways of preserving the environment that are consistent with economic development, which they see as essential. That if people's basic needs aren't taken care of, they're not going to give a shit about the environment. Basically,
yeah,
that's what these guys say, and they also say that there's been this tendency among some old school environmentalists to be suspicious of science and technology when the Breakthrough Institute says that these are essential for helping us solve our problems. They're very pro nuclear power. They're very pro genetically modified foods. So I went a year ago and loved it. It was just incredibly stimulating. The conversations. Even there would be ideas that I was skeptical toward, but I found fascinating, and they really sort of forced me to challenge some of my own stale thinking about the environment.
Yeah.
What happened? So I went again this year, and the meeting is at this resort right at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin County. It's just spectacular, and that's part of the appeal. But this year,
sure.
I was actually in a little breakout session one afternoon. So it wasn't the full meeting where there were a few hundred people. There were just about 20 people, and we're talking about, we're supposed to be thinking of opportunities for the what do they call it? The Anthropocene. This is the term that some people have used to describe this modern era of profound human transformation of the planet. Yeah. And one of the leaders of the session was Stuart Brand.
Oh yeah, Whole Earth Catalog, Portola Institute.
So he created the Whole Earth Catalog back in, I think it was like 70 or 71.
Yeah, I was in college, I remember.
Yeah, it was like a guide for people, for the counterculture, for people who wanted to create their own communities or go live in the mountains or wherever.
And good technology.
Pardon me?
Yeah, I think he used the term something similar anyway. Good technology.
Good technology, yeah. So you could live off the grid. You could have a teepee and have little solar panels, right? He basically told you where you could get stuff to make this kind of life.
Yeah. Oh, it was wonderful. Yeah.
And it was really romantic. And I had a copy when I was a kid. And
I do. Yeah, I think I still have one that I dug out somewhere recently.
Yeah, it was really an amazing document. And he's become this kind of legendary figure in the counterculture. And so we're all talking about opportunities. Another person who was there was Charles Mann, who's an old friend of yours, I think.
Yeah, Cam.
Brilliant, Cam Mann, a brilliant science journalist.
Yeah.
And so we're all talking about the opportunities. And then, I was determined to say something about warfare, my obsession. and
That's part of
that
it. Yeah.
that I thought there would be opportunities in trying to reduce militarism, and let's not forget there are nuclear weapons still out there. So there are these great threats, and we've got to do something about them. And Brand kind of like grimaced, and then he gave a speech to the effect that the dangers of nuclear weapons have been greatly overstated.
Yeah.
And that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those populations were thriving today. Those cities were doing just fine.
Yeah.
They survived those nuclear blasts.
Yeah.
And some of our fears of nuclear apocalypse, that, a nuclear war would destroy all life on Earth, were really exaggerated.
Like the Jonathan Shell thing, where where the Earth is completely wiped out, and
Fate of the Earth.
Fate of the Earth. That's
which
what I'm
was
trying
a book.
to think of.
I think it started as a series of articles in the New Yorker, then it was published as a
whole
book.
issue. Yeah.
And George, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I read that book in I think it was the fall of 1981, or read the articles in the New Yorker, and it like had a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
And so much that I actually wrote a fan letter to Jonathan Shell, which I think might be the only fan letter I have ever written in my life.
Wow.
And as a result, it convinced me to apply to Columbia Journalism School. I thought, I want to be like Jonathan Shell. I want, what he did was amazing. It was a literary work, but also a profound argument.
Yeah.
And I never heard back from him, but I applied to journalism school. I got in, so it had a big impact on me.
Yeah. Wow.
And you're right; it did paint a very apocalyptic picture of what would happen in a nuclear war. But Brand, so Brand, he's somebody who's become very, very pro-nuclear power, and apparently, as in the course of realizing that his old hippie opposition to nuclear power was really naive and not based on the facts. Yeah. He's decided that maybe many of us have had a distorted picture about the true risks of nuclear weapons, and so it really bothered me. I decided I didn't want to get in a big argument about that with him right there. And I tried to forget about it, but I really brooded over it because it bothered me, because I think nuclear weapons are still a terrible, terrible threat.
Yeah.
And so I ended up writing a piece about, that, talked about what would happen if a Hiroshima-sized bomb went off today over Manhattan, let's say.
Yeah, right.
And then also talking about how that's like a firecracker compared to the thermonuclear bombs that constitute the arsenals of the United States and Russia. And but it's and I'm curious to know what you think. I also cited the work of this political scientist who's had a big impact on my thinking about war and security issues. His name is John Mueller. He's at Ohio State, and he wrote a whole book called Atomic Obsession, which also said that we're in the grip of nuclear alarmism, and that it has perversely fueled the arms race, and that he thinks we should take a more measured view of nuclear weapons.
So the idea that like the whole huge escalation during the Cold War was sort of an overreaction. Like, so what if the Soviets also have nuclear weapons and we don't really need to, match them, one to one. But, of course, that, the whole issue of mutual assured deterrence kind of confuses that, doesn't it?
Right. Well, the
mutual assured destruction.
There's so many paradoxes. I mean, so we're not actually talking about the facts necessarily. In some cases you are. There's some people who have just made exaggerated claims, like, the idea that maybe all life on Earth would be extinguished by...
Well, the Jonathan Shell thing. And it sounded like from your column that Brand was saying that was really kind of ridiculous. And that, that basically, obviously nuclear weapons are bad. The Hiroshima bomb, no one has a good count, but, so somewhere on the order of 150,000 people were killed, just very, very, very quickly, immediately or days after, which is, no one could say that's anything but horrible. And then you read John Hershey's Hiroshima, which was another issue of the New Yorker, and you really, see the horror. And then just imagining that happening and again anywhere, but then imagine it happening dozens of times in an all-out nuclear exchange. I mean, that would obviously be devastating, even if it didn't wipe out the Earth.
Yeah. What makes this issue complicated is that we're talking about, in a way, how to write about these things and what sorts of emotions to evoke. And,
well, yeah.
What's interesting is that this is related also to, there's a parallel in the environmental movement about how you should talk about global warming. Should you try to scare the hell out of people?
Right.
Or should you be optimistic on them and upbeat? The Breakthrough Institute people say you need to be optimistic and you need to hold out hope. If you tell everybody that we're doomed, then they're just going to give up. They're going to despair.
Yeah, so just say, this is a problem. It's always going to be with us, and here's things we can do, and this is this new world we'll be living in.
Right.
Earth with 2 A's, as Bill McKibben calls it.
Right. And, they had a what I guess you might call, what the Breakthrough people would call an environmental alarmist at the meeting named Clive Hamilton, who he was like the token anti-Breakthrough guy.
Yeah.
Because he says basically we're fucked. And he thought it was irresponsible and immoral to try to put a happy face on things.
Yeah, there's a big backlash against the whole Breakthrough Institute movement, but I think some of the criticism's been kind of extreme and unfair. But this thing with Brand, I mean, obviously he thinks nuclear weapons are a horrible thing, and I noticed some of the there was a couple comments from people who were at the meeting who weren't sure that Brand really quite meant what it sounded like he meant to you, or
that's what Charles Mann said. And
he
said that he had talked to Brand about this issue. I was hoping,
that's right.
I was hoping that if I misquoted Brand, he would correct me. But the one thing I do remember and that really struck me, and I think this is what provoked me into writing my piece, was I mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah. And he said, they're doing fine. They're doing fine now.
Yeah.
Which to me...
well, now, maybe, yeah.
Right.
But,
which seemed
interesting,
weirdly
though.
cold.
Well, yeah, although it's maybe this is part of what he was thinking about, but it's also true that people have this a very exaggerated idea of the bad after effects as far as the effect of radiation on the people who survived and live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the future generations. I mean, I would have assumed before I looked into it, when I was writing the Cancer Chronicles, that, the increased cancer rate for all kinds of cancers, leukemia particularly, since that's known to be triggered by ionizing radiation. But, you'd think it would just be like through the roof. And it was but it's more like, a few percent, which is still terrible. That's a few percent of, a lot of people, and it's a lot of excess cancer deaths, but it's nothing like you would expect. It was kind of like, too, the aftermath of Chernobyl, and we talked about that before when I went out and took the tour there, and you expect it to be this wasteland with all these, two-headed wild hogs running around and things like this. And, it's nothing of the kind, because nature adapted rather gracefully to the radiation. But, of course, this happened after, they're still in the midst of a massive cleanup by, good old human engineering, which is just the kind of thing I guess the Breakthrough Institute might point out. We have this amazing wherewithal to even deal with, apocalyptic disasters like that, much more gradual disasters like global warming.
Yeah, I get that. And by the way, it's been explained to me that the radiation within the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been much greater if those had been ground bursts, but they were air bursts.
Probably. Yeah. So, there's all kinds of variables.
So there was just much less radioactive material because of that.
Yeah.
I put, my goal is that the eradication of nuclear weapons. I think that that's essential. I think we have to do it once and for all.
Yeah.
The assumption of mutual assured destruction is that humans are rational. Mm-hmm. And it's worked so far, but I cited some writing about the Cuban Missile Crisis in my piece on this exchange with Stuart Brand by a colleague of mine at Stevens named Alex Wellerstein, really brilliant young nuclear historian. And he pointed out that over time, we have gradually realized that the Cuban Missile Crisis came much closer to nuclear war than anyone realized at the time.
Yeah.
This also emerged in the film The Fog of War, which was an in-depth interview with Robert McNamara, who was one of the players in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Wellerstein points out that the Cubans had many more nuclear weapons in place than the Americans realized at the time, and they were prepared to use them.
Yeah.
And even without the permission of Khrushchev, there were people in Cuba, including Fidel Castro, who would have been willing to take that step if the Americans had invaded, they said.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if the Cubans had used them, we would have used them.
And then you think what the effect would have been. And I just kept, reading your column, I kept thinking about 9/11. And, the impact that one attack on the World Trade Center and, the destruction of the World Trade Center and what was it? Was it 2,000 lives? And the profound negative effect that had on the United States economy.
Right.
And that we're still feeling. It had, I believe most economists would agree that, that was a major factor in the recession that we went through and the reason that we're...
I thought you were going to say that to me that the by far the most damaging effect has been on U.S. foreign policy, U.S. behavior.
Oh, well, that too. But just on the other issue for a moment, it was, you think of the effect that had. And, sure, we absorbed it and we soldiered on, so to speak. We absorbed the impact, and it wasn't nearly as bad economically as some people think. But you think what a nuclear blast on just one American city, the effect that would have would be many, many, many times greater, even if it was just limited to one, say, accidental detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Yeah,
or a terrorist.
And if we're talking about threats to civilization, the greatest threat I see, and again, this is extrapolating from our reaction to 9/11, is on democracy. And, I could see the U.S. declare, depending on, how quickly we figure out who did it and who the bad guys are. I could see the U.S. declaring martial law. I could see really bad things happening at a political level in response to something like that. And that then could have repercussions around the world.
Yeah.
So, it's just, and of course, my argument is that it's not just nuclear weapons. We get rid of nuclear weapons as part of a process of de-arming the world, de-arming the U.S., not completely, but down to levels where nations are prepared to defend themselves, but not to wage wars around the world.
Yeah. Well, would the Breakthrough Institute reaction to this, and I'm just guessing because I don't know, would be that it's just unrealistic to ever think we'll be able to get rid of nuclear weapons. The whole letting the genie out of the bottle, the technology exists, people can find out how to do it. They can reinvent it. There's always the chance of, it being done quietly by terrorists or a rogue regime, and then suddenly, someone has even just a few nuclear weapons or even one, and then nobody else has any to use as a deterrent. So
they don't
and
really.
So therefore, I mean, they probably don't take a position on this.
They don't really. One of my complaints about, I try to think of things to criticize them for.
Yeah.
And even though I really admire them, but I figure it's almost my responsibility to sort of challenge.
Well, yeah. And there's some good arguments against some of their positions, I think.
Yeah.
Like the whole decoupling.
One of the things that I've come up with is that I don't think they spend enough time on issues related to war and peace and security, especially since in the United States, I see our military spending as like this gigantic opportunity. All this money and ingenuity that's going toward weapons, and preparations for war that could be used for improving our energy infrastructure and transportation and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it could be related to this whole environmental argument.
Yeah.
Well, did they talk about? I really got interested, several times on with the Breakthrough Institute, and then recently there was an exchange. Oh, I know, it was my friend Michelle Nyhouse, an environmental writer, wrote a piece in the Elements blog of the New Yorker criticizing the Breakthrough Institute's eco-modernist manifesto, and then Ted Nordhaus was firing back at her, and the issue had to do with this word decoupling.
Yes,
and it's really interesting. I mean, kind of the idea that basically you decouple human economic progress from the boot print that it leaves on the environment. Is that right? So you concentrate development within cities so you can have more green space and farmland, and you use technologically intense agricultural methods to get the most you can out of smaller amounts of land to feed more people, and then so you're decoupling progress with the impact on the environment. And then it seems, as I looked into this a little further, actually I just got curious about this last night and was Googling around, and there's this argument about relative decoupling versus absolute. So if you're decoupling just enough so you can keep growing and you're destroying the environment or impacting the environment at a lesser rate, but you're still doing it, increasingly, just not, just not as an accelerated process as you were before. So you're slowly increasing your impact on the environment rather than rapidly increasing it as the economy grows. And then while absolute decoupling would mean you're really going to limit it so it's going to get no worse than it is now and only better.
Mm-hmm.
And so that interests me because, I don't know, and I probably just haven't looked deeply enough, but what the Breakthrough Institute's position is on population growth. And there's just been such a, like in the last 10 or more years, this movement toward basically the idea of world population control is almost off the table, and hardly anyone except a minority of people are advocating this or thinking about this. A very intense minority, and it's just sort of been either given up on as impossible, or some people even look at it as being exploitative, like a means of limiting the number of brown people on Earth. So it's like a colonial oppression. And right. I just find that very, very disturbing, because it seems to me that you want to take the idea of decoupling and then combine that with population shrinkage, or at least stabilization, instead of growth. But I guess some people see a danger of using decoupling as an excuse to just further ignore the population problem and say, well, yeah, the Earth can support many, many, many times more people than it does. And sure, it can, but not in a way that's not going to be miserable.
I'm pretty sure that their position would be that the rate of growth of the population has been dropping for some time. We aren't seeing anything like the catastrophic extreme growth that was predicted by Paul Ehrlich and others a few decades ago. And this is part of a natural process, the demographic transition, where once people start getting more prosperous and especially when girls get more opportunities, so they don't see
Yeah.
themselves as baby factories, the birth rate just starts to naturally decline.
Well, yeah, that's a common argument, but in developed countries. So you have to develop the countries, and then this will happen instead of trying to deal with the population like directly. Is that the?
Well, yeah, this is actually already happening in some places. Well, let's take China as an example. My
Yeah,
understanding is that the one-child policy now is
yeah,
being phased out, or it's getting really kind of
yeah,
squishy now. There are more and more
yeah,
equals. I just talked
yeah,
to a colleague of mine at Stevens who's Chinese about this because it's
mm,
been successful. The birth rate has
yeah,
really come down in China, and
yeah,
that
and
even in Pakistan and some other places
hmm,
where there are real, there's a lot of opposition to birth control.
hmm.
The birth rate has fallen,
In
uh,
Pakistan,
and in Iran also
yeah,
apparently. So I
yeah,
think that there is so much concern about mandatory birth controls
yeah,
as being inconsistent with democracy, that
yeah.
the hope is that it will, birth rate will just keep falling as part of this
Yeah,
its
that just
natural
seems to
process.
me to be just unrealistically optimistic, especially when you think, how long is this going to take and what's it going to be like? I mean, the people who suffer the most are the poorest people. I keep thinking of that piece that the New Delhi bureau chief for the Times wrote just before he decided he had to get his family out of New Delhi, and just describing what the air pollution was like there.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be any time within a century or two, I don't think, before you're not going to have these horrible concentrations of population of very poor people who are just barely able to survive. And then maybe if you develop the world economy to a greater, more rapid extent, and use nuclear power and intense agriculture, you can feed them and support them so that their lives are better. But I don't know, it's just hard for me to see how you can really be serious about the future of the world environmental movement and the world environment and the economy and all of this without just dealing directly with population growth. And I
I
don't know how you do that. Whether it's mandatory or whether you just have more funding for programs offering the option of contraception in developing countries.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who were on that problem, but you're right. There are certainly environmentalists who, for political reasons, for reasons of marketing their own message and
Yeah,
trying to be as inclusive as possible, stay away from that issue. By the way,
well,
I
yeah,
just
including the Sierra Club. It just seems appalling to me. I mean,
that you think it's kind of cowardly.
yeah, I mean, it's almost like you can almost not make the argument anymore. It's just sort of like been removed from things that are considered okay topics to talk about and be a good liberal.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the brief point that decoupling, the way I understand it, also there are different meanings, but one meaning is a very kind of literal meaning of it,
Hmm.
means that we're insulated from the environment to a certain extent
Yeah,
by living in climate controlled houses and cars and working in
yeah,
climate controlled buildings.
yeah.
And so, obviously, air conditioning is an essential part of that. So, some of I've actually heard some breakthrough type people say, well, global warming it's going to be sort of uncomfortable, but remember, we have air conditioning.
Oh, yeah. So we're decoupled in the sense, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So it's all related to the other kind of decoupling, but
I
yeah,
keep,
yeah, yeah. Basically, again, we have this ability to use technology
yeah, I
to
keep
deal
think,
with this if you happen to be one of the rich people in the
right.
earth, that can afford the luxury and the huge electrical use that air conditioning entails.
Yeah. I, when I keep thinking about, I was in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia right after the first Gulf War
Hmm.
in 1990, and
Yeah,
uh, I so you're in these air conditioned buildings and hotels and cars, but then I went out into out into the desert to look at places where Iraqis had been bombed by Americans, and I went to see the oil fires which were still burning. And my recollection, and I don't know if this is right, but the number that sticks in my head is that it was 130 degrees out on the desert when on one of the days that I went.
Yeah.
What I remember was that I'm in a Land Rover, and it's probably like 65 degrees inside the Land Rover. Driving around with some Saudi guy, and then we stop, and then we get out, and people say it's like an oven. This really, really felt like an oven.
Yeah,
felt like sticking your head in an oven that's baking.
Yeah,
and you couldn't be outside for long, but
except people are,
who live there.
Yeah, so, yeah. And then people who live there with, maybe not Saudi Arabia so much, but, there's people who live in these areas that don't and will never have the luxury of air conditioning.
Right. Well,
they're not decoupled at all.
One of the huge fights that breaks out, usually you're pretty much hearing one side at the Breakthrough Institute, but one of the issues that they are wrestling with has to do with the development of the poor. In a way, you could say this is maybe the essential issue for the environmental movement. How do you reconcile cutting back energy consumption and consumption of fossil fuels with the appalling poverty in many regions of the world today, where people are still using wood?
And that's part of the argument that they have the right to technology that we've enjoyed, but, we can use our expertise to make this be cleaner technology.
Right.
Give them nuclear instead of coal.
Right.
Solar,
so forth.
Yeah, nuclear, if you agree, that's cleaner. And that's a whole nother another issue that we've talked about before. But,
I wanted to point out before we run out of time that this is a momentous week. We're recording this on August 4th, and it's 70 years ago. Well, 70 years ago on July 16th was the Trinity test.
Right.
It was the first detonation of a nuclear device right near where you live.
Yeah.
And then of course
miles.
On August 6th, that was when the U.S. Dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later it dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki.
Right.
So there are a lot of people. We've been talking about the risks of nuclear weapons, and there's been a lot of writing and chatter about the origin of nuclear weapons and where we stand now. I just wanted to mention that I posted something weird this morning. I didn't send it to you, but I'll just tell you briefly what it is. I just remembered this story last night and whipped together a post on it. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you before, but in 1942, Edward Teller, so this is pretty early in the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when Los Alamos was set up. I think it was maybe 42 or 43.
Yeah, right in there.
Well, so a lot of the physicists were in Berkeley. There was a working group studying the
William Lawrence's lab, and then Oppenheimer was in both at Berkeley and Caltech then.
So Oppenheimer was part of this group. Hans Bethe was part of it. Edward Teller, and so in 1991, I interviewed Hans Bethe for Scientific American. I was doing a profile of him, and I heard this weird story about Teller having some kind of doomsday prediction back in the middle of the Manhattan Project, and so I decided to ask and I didn't know how real it was, so I decided to ask Beta. And his
Yeah.
first reaction was like, "Oh God, I don't want to talk about that anymore. It's gotten too much attention." And I said, "Oh, come on." And so he said, "Okay, here's what happened. Teller just burst in, and he said that he had done some calculations, and he was worried that the fission explosion would trigger a fusion reaction in the atmosphere,
Yeah, right,
and
right.
basically ignite the entire Earth's atmosphere and burn up the whole Earth."
Yeah, yeah.
And
Jonathan Shell, like,
and Oppenheimer was really worried about it.
yeah.
And-
They were taking bets on it, right? That's what I seem
Well,
to
that
recall.
happened a little bit later. So very quickly, what happened? Oppenheimer went to Compton, who was like a major figure. He was at
Arthur Compton. Yeah.
Chicago. I guess this is
Yeah.
the Compton of Compton scattering.
Yeah.
And Compton was pretty worried about it. Meanwhile, Beta had done a calculation that convinced him that there was no chance this could happen.
Yeah.
And that the radiation would dissipate too quickly in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And then there was another guy named Konopinski who was part of the group, who I guess was really good at doing these sorts of calculations, and he did
Yeah, you hope.
showing it. Pardon me?
Yeah, you hope.
Yeah.
It's-
Well, that's
kind of
the
this-
thing.
Yeah, there's this arrogance.
Yeah.
We understand this new technology, this newly, discovered force so well that we can calculate whether or not this will happen and whether we as a small group should decide to go with it or not.
Well, one of the things there are a bunch of things I love about this. One is that Edward Teller was the scaredy cat, and
Yeah.
Edward and what's fascinating is that apparently the idea for a fusion weapon which
Yeah.
would be ignited by fission was already in the air in 1942. Teller apparently was already
Oh.
thinking about it.
Huh.
But then he had this thought that, oh shit, this bad thing might happen.
Yeah.
And so he's worried about it. But then Compton apparently never completely ruled out the possibility, but he decided the probability was small, and so that the test could go ahead. Apparently, he has veto power
Yeah.
over it.
Yeah.
But Beta had ruled it out. But
Yeah.
but there's a lot of chatter about it. So on the day of Trinity, apparently Enrico Fermi, who was a real jokester, started
Yeah.
taking bets with everybody
Oh, it's fair.
on whether
Okay. Yeah.
on whether the Earth would end
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
result
Yeah.
of the test.
Yeah.
That's like
That's scary. Yeah.
physicists' idea of humor.
Yeah. Well, at least now we know. That
Right.
didn't happen. But yeah.
But it's funny.
Good.
Because I dug up the exact transcript of my discussion with Beta, and I
Yeah.
said, okay, all right. So on the day of the test, were you thinking at all about the calculation and the possibility?
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
said, no,
Yeah.
not at all. He said he was only worried about whether the thing was going to work at all, because he had worked on
Yeah.
the ignition system,
Yeah.
and he wasn't sure. He wasn't absolutely sure that was going to work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's that whole saga of Los Alamos and Trinity and the bombing of Japan. It's just I can just never read enough about it. It's just always some interesting new layer.
I've got this guy Alex Wallerstein, who's been my colleague now for like a year.
Yeah.
And he's so steeped in knowledge of the history of nuclear weapons, and
Wow.
almost every time I talk to him about it or read anything that he's written, I learn something.
Yeah.
So he has a post on the old topic of whether there were options to
Yeah.
dropping bombs on populated centers, and
Well,
I didn't
yeah,
think there was anything new to say. But what
Yeah.
he said, he has written that I never heard before, is that we had the capacity and even planned to build up to 5 bombs within a month or 2 months after dropping bombs on on Japan. And
Yeah.
so there was a very high-level study that went up to the Secretary of War, didn't go all the way to Truman,
Yeah.
of the possibility of a demonstration test of dropping a bomb
Yeah.
over Tokyo Harbor,
Yeah.
which would be in view of the Imperial Palace. So,
Yeah.
the emperor could see it.
Yeah.
And this was considered, and it was ruled out for a couple of reasons, according to Alex. One was there was a fear that maybe the bomb wouldn't work, and it would,
Yeah.
that'd be really embarrassing.
Then then the emperor would have only been emboldened.
Right, but
Yeah.
but what Alex said is that shouldn't have been a legitimate concern, because we had one more bomb in reserve and several in the pipeline that could easily have been used.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But he said
I mean, it's
another
also-
part of the reasoning was that there are people who wanted to drop the bomb
Yeah.
on a populated area, and actually Hiroshima was chosen in part because it had been untouched by U.S. bombing so far.
Mm.
And they wanted a nice, pristine target to show the rest of the world and to learn exactly what would happen when a bomb goes off.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was pretty cold.
Oh, well, yeah, that whole thing, too. Like, a year or so ago, I reviewed this new biography of Robert Oppenheimer by Ray Monk. I reviewed it for the New York Times book review, and, just reliving, some of these details and learning some new ones, or being reminded that, right after, we had the bomb ready, by that time Germany had surrendered, and then a lot of the scientists on the Manhattan Project really felt like, hey, what we signed up for was, using this to stop the Nazis, and do we really need to use this against Japan? And, I think some of these were advocates for some, middle ground, like exploding the bomb on a remote island as a demonstration, or maybe what you described, with Tokyo Harbor, instead of, just wiping out two cities with, mostly civilian populations.
Yeah.
But yeah, and this was, and of course, and Oppenheimer himself was very divided at that point, and that all kind of fed into the later doubts about his loyalty, along with some of his indiscretions.
Right.
But a fascinating human being.
Apparently, the first choice for a while was, Alex, my colleague, gave a little talk, and he showed us, he dug up a list that dates from, I guess 1945. They're trying to decide where to drop the bombs, and they had cities ranked in terms of their attractiveness as targets.
Wow.
And for quite a while, Kyoto was the number one target,
God.
and that was ruled out basically because of the personal opposition of Henry Stimson, who had apparently, it's not clear whether it was just because he had been to Kyoto when he was stationed in the Far East, or and had kind of fallen in love with it, or he said, but according to things that he actually wrote down, he said this was such a beloved city of Japan. It was a cultural center. It was not a military city. That it would be seen as a war crime, as an atrocity, not only by the Japanese, but by the rest of the world.
It would be like picking Jerusalem or Benares in India.
But the thing was, Hiroshima was not really a militarily significant target. And again, if you look at some of the memos of going back and forth over which cities to bomb, in part it was because it was kind of a typical city with large civilian centers. That was one of the reasons it was chosen.
Yeah. Now, I thought that I'd read that there were a large number of troops that were stationed in Hiroshima. Maybe I'm wrong, but that this was part of the reason why it's been so hard to get a what's considered a really definitive death toll, because we're not sure what the population of the city was because of this transient population. But
Yeah,
I don't want to say that with any authority because I may have garbled it in my memory.
well, I know there was some military presence, but my understanding is that it was pretty small. I don't really understand why the uncertainty over the casualties is so enormous. I think I just this morning I looked on Wikipedia and it said something like 80 to 160,000.
Yeah, and I think it had to do with one way or the other, like not having a good estimate of the original population, and that having to do with the transient population that I thought was military stationed there. But even so, even if that's the case, it was definitely not this major military center by any means.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know
that's true because the population account of Nagasaki is also it's just as uncertain, right?
Yeah. It's, it's like
a
factor of 2 in both cases. Alex, sorry to keep going back to Alex, but he's just like a treasure trove of interesting information. He has a post that he wrote 2 years ago, and I'm going to post something on it in the next couple of days. It's basically just looking at photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he pointed out that a lot of the photographs that you see of them after the bombing, they show what look like lunar landscapes. He says, look, they're black and white, and you see these wastelands, and it just looks like everything has been vaporized. And he said that those actually give a very inaccurate impression of what the cities look like. He said those tended to be taken months or even a year after the bombings, when all the rubble had been cleared and all the bodies had been cleared. A lot of work had already been done on cleanup. And then he posted all these other photographs that were color photographs and were sort of more random, that just show give a sense of the sort of messiness of the destruction. And the point that he makes is that there actually were some people who have said that the bombings were, I don't know how anybody could say this after reading John Hershey's work on Hiroshima, but there have been people who've said that the deaths in Nagasaki and Hiroshima were relatively quick and painless. People were just vaporized, and Alex said that that's not the case, and that people were burned and crushed much in the same way that they would have been in conventional bombing raids, but then plus the radiation sickness. So he just he thought it was important to dispel any illusion.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
Wow, so you're going to post something about that, and then I'll link to some of these photos?
And just try to turn more people onto Alex's blog, because as I said, he's always
I'm going to check it out. Yeah, let's put a link to that. Yeah. Well, we're kind of running up toward the hour.
Okay, I'll just tell. I have to tell you one more weird personal connection I have to all this. So my father is 91 years old. And he had just arrived at Annapolis when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he went to Annapolis because he thought it was a great free education. And then it was like, oh shit. He told me all this because I wrote a book about him for his 80th birthday, interviewed him, learned all this stuff about his life.
Oh, what a great thing.
And then he talked about his wartime experiences. He was on a destroyer called the Madison, first in the Mediterranean, and then when the Germans surrendered, they went to the Pacific. And he was there, stationed on an island in the Pacific in late July, when he got a call when the ship received orders for a search mission. And so they went steaming out, and this was the Indianapolis. So the Indianapolis was the cruiser that right after Trinity rushed the parts for Little Boy to to an island where it was assembled
Wow.
before the bombing of Hiroshima, and then the Indianapolis was leaving, and it was cruising around in the Pacific, and it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, and it sank very, very quickly. About 300 men went down, and all the rest went into the water. And out of about 1,100 men, 300 survived. 500 or 600 died waiting for 3 days to be rescued. Many of them were eaten by sharks.
Wow.
And of course, this scene, it was the inspiration for a famous scene in the movie Jaws, where the crazy ship captain talks about being on the crew of the Indianapolis and worried about being eaten by sharks.
Wow.
And that's why he hates sharks so much. So anyway, my father was on this destroyer, the Madison, that picked up the poor survivors of the Indianapolis who had delivered Little Boy.
Oh, wow. What a story.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then a couple of weeks later, my father was in Tokyo Harbor, and he could see across the harbor to the battleship where I'm not sure if it was the Japanese commander-in-chief or the emperor who was surrendering to General MacArthur.
Yeah.
So he had a personal view of some amazing history.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. It's amazing.
All right, that's all I got.
I think that's a good note to wrap things up on.
Right.
Yeah.
We're right at an hour.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of grim subject matter.
Yeah. And not entirely, but
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Sorry, we didn't get to your.
Oh yeah, well, for another time, yeah, we can do a raw data roundup.
Right. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll write another one by that time.
Okay, maybe toward the end of August or early September.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, man.
Okay, hang in there.
All right, you too, George.
Okay, good talking to you.